Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast, where once again we're going to dive into the fascinating world of technology and innovation and the impacts that it has on businesses. So I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and I've got a great guest lined up for you today. His name's Gabriele Columbro, General Manager of the Linux Foundation Europe, and he's also the Executive Director of FINOS. But today he's going to be sharing his insights on the exciting developments in the open source domain. From the geopolitics of open source and the rapid growth of the Linux Foundation in Europe to the role of the public sector in open source sustainability. We've got so much to cover, and his commitment to fostering collaboration is truly inspiring. So I cannot wait to get him on the podcast today. So buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to California, where today's guest is waiting to speak with us. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, Neil, it's a pleasure to be on the show. So my name is Gabriele Columbro, more recently the Executive Director of FINOS, and now splitting my time as General Manager for Linux Foundation Europe, which is the first regional entity from the Linux Foundation that we launched in September last year. A little bit about me. I am based out of California, as you can probably hear from that Italian part of California. I'm originally from Italy, and which probably made me quite a good candidate for LF Europe. In terms of my background, I definitely have a strong sort of technical background. I have a master's in computer engineering, and fair to say that I've been born and raised in open source, both on a personal basis, participating and building open source communities from a development, release management, and really community building standpoint. And of course, I have a pretty strong experience in commercial open source. I used to work for a UK company called Alfresco, which is an open source enterprise content management. And that's before I entered the magical world of open source foundations, first with FINOS and then with the Linux Foundation. Once again, thanks for having me here.
It's an absolute honor to have you on here. And I'm conscious there'll be some people listening, hearing about the Linux Foundation Europe for the very first time. So can you tell me a little bit more about it? Some of the primary objectives around it too.
Absolutely. Well, so I'm assuming, first of all, probably fair to say, for those of you who are new to the Linux Foundation in general, that, of course, the Linux Foundation does much more than Linux. We started as the fiscal sponsor and the host for the Linux kernel development, but since then, over the last 20 years, the Linux Foundation has grown into what effectively is the largest sort of shared technology investment in the world. We host major projects like Kubernetes, like Node, more recently PyTorch on the AI side. The DLF really hosts over 900 projects, has multi-thousand members that support us in our mission, and open source is global in nature, and the Linux Foundation itself it has a global presence. In fact, about 30% of our members, several of our projects are what I would call Europe or European or Europe strong, if that makes sense. But we realized over time that Europe is unique in the sense that is the only place where you have a supranational entity like the European Union, really defining on one hand intellectual property rules and collaboration across 27 sovereign states, as well as it's clearly driving a common agenda across the different states when it comes to not only technology, but really societal and sort of social goals. And so it became quite clear last year that having a regional entity focused on being able to stand up projects in Europe, focused on really nurturing what effectively is one of the largest regions when it comes to open source contributors. I mean, Europe has a massive grassroots open source community, was really the next step of developing the footprint of the Linux Foundation across our global footprint. And so we launched in September. It's been a fun ride, and our tagline is collaborate locally, innovate globally, in the sense that we want to foster regional collaborations, but we want to make sure that doesn't create further fragmentation or silos. And we think that the LF, with its global platform, is very well positioned to enable global open source success for some of these projects.
And for saying you only launched in September, you've got such a huge membership already. So I've got to ask, are there any of those members that you could name drop here today? And what factors do you attribute LF's Europe's rapid growth? And what are your future plans for expansion?
We just passed the 100 members mark. You're absolutely right. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason is we already have a pretty well-developed European community. About 30% of the global Linux Foundation members are from Europe. We have pretty strong European representation in our projects. Even before we launched LF Europe, projects like Linux Foundation Energy, who brings together some of the most important energy providers in Europe, or RISC-V, who really is a global effort, but it's based out of Switzerland, or efforts like OS Climate or AgStack are really very much focused around impact-type causes that are very close to the EU or broadly the European goals for technology. So on one hand, the Linux Foundation is a very well-renowned and trusted brand. On the other hand, the region, I think, was ripe for an additional focus and investment for the Linux Foundation, which, as you say, over the first 7 months has really sort of proven to be a correct investment. We're seeing a lot of momentum from our members, a lot of excitement. And of course, the first and foremost reason why we launched the entity was really to stand up projects in Europe that really are reflective of more specific European goals or more specific public-private sector type collaborations in Europe. And so having launched now 2 projects, I think there are sort of 2 projects that are very much a good example of the type of collaborations we see developing in Europe. On one hand, we have Silva, which is a telco cloud effort sponsored by the largest telcos in Europe. So a very good example of how vertical industries undergoing the digital transformation are now really looking at open source as their prime vehicle for mutualizing common goals and common pain points, the solution for common pain points. And on the other hand, we have the Open Wallet Foundation, which we launched earlier in 2023, that really shows a strong connection with the goals of the public sector. You probably are familiar with the fact that the EU is rolling out eIDAS 2, which is the European ID, which actually we are looking very closely to implement through the Open Wallet engine code that is going to be put out. So again, a great example of I think a broader goal. I think LF Europe is really going to be great at bringing together the public and private sector into open source collaborations. Looking forward, well, you can expect more projects coming into Europe even this year. And of course, another big area of collaboration has been policy. There are many sort of policy is coming down from the EU that are really going to regulate software and more broadly technology. And we certainly expect to play a key part in educating the region as to how open source can both address some of this regulation, but also continue to thrive in the region and more globally.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little research and I was reading how LF Europe has been working with the public sector to enhance open source software, engagement and sustainability. So to bring that to life, can you tell me a little bit more about that and maybe share a few success stories, maybe some ongoing initiatives around this area?
Oh, absolutely. Well, look, we are, as open source eats the world, we are starting to realize how, especially in Europe, there are areas where the whole open source community needs to work much more closely with the public sector. We think this is going to be a very good complement to how currently our projects are funded, which is primarily through the corporate and private sector sort of membership, especially because, again, the EU in particular has a really strong vision for open source and what it can deliver in terms of the digital commons, digital sovereignty, and truly the sort of European technology leadership on the global scale. So we've done a few, granted we only started 7 months ago, and I have a really interesting new hire starting on June 1st who is going to really accelerate this process. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it yet. But in terms of the areas where we started engaging with the public sector, I think there's three areas. One, we really started engaging the public sector in our projects. The Open Wallet Foundation is a great example of it, where we are working very closely with the European Commission. And we also are forming a government advisory council that is going to provide a clear venue for the public sector, both at municipal, regional, state, and EU level, to influence the evolution of the project and ensure that there is compatibility with the EU requirements when it comes to the European-wide ID. So an active engagement in our projects is definitely sort of the longer-term goal and nirvana state, where we see the public sector not only consuming, but really helping us shape the direction of some of these projects. I think the second angle, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a success story just yet, but certainly providing a mature counterpart, interlocutor to the European Commission as they come down with legislations like the Cyber Residency Act. And I want to double click on that a little bit, but the Linux Foundation, as you probably know, has been doing a lot of work globally to bolster open source security, open source supply chain security. And so we're really keen to see the EU promulgating legislation around cyber resiliency. But, as the law is drafted right now, it does risk to impact individual contributors and the very fabric of open source. So we've been working together with the other foundations in Europe to really continue to educate lawmakers and make sure that the Cyber Resiliency Act doesn't create sort of inadvertent side effects to the open source community. So I guess the second point is really sort of policy collaboration. And then the third one is absolutely working and sort of gearing up towards working more closely with the EU on their grants and public sector funding of open source projects. Together with other foundations, we applied to a couple of Horizon grants. We think that the EU is sort of putting their money where their mouth is, in the sense that they have grand goals for open source and they're funding those efforts. And so we want to make sure that we bring sort of our global experience to the table to make sure that these investments are as effective as possible. Sort of on the same area, actually last week, the German Tech Sovereign Fund did do a major contribution to OpenJS, which is one of the foundations under the Linux Foundation. I think it was $875,000 to really bolster critical projects in terms of their security and their sustainability. So LFEAB has been, of course, praising this effort. We would like to see more. We see a lot of potential both here on this side of the pond in the US and in Europe for the public sector to really take an active role in securing the open source supply chain, which effectively powers the most critical infrastructure out there. So just to recap, engagement in projects, policy work, and really helping the EU maximize their investment in open source in the form of grants and direct-to-project funding.
And I'm curious, in the context then of open source and policy, how do you see the implications of the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive, or the CRA? I'm curious, what aspects do you find it positive about it? Which ones do you believe need a bit of improvement?
So yeah, the Cyber Resiliency Act, as you probably have heard in the news, has been one of the areas that has certainly caught the attention of the open source community at large and the most engaged open source foundations out there. And it also sort of kind of goes hand in hand with the product liability directive that it's coming down. Look, we could probably talk hours about the Cyber Resilience Act, and there's plenty of material out there, including open letters that we put out, proposed amendments that goes in detail. But in a nutshell, the positive aspect is, of course, the intent, first and foremost. The EU realizes that open source and just in general software needs to be secure when it's delivered to end users. And the EU is really amping up the requirements on commercial hardware and software providers to ensure that they have the responsibility to secure the software that they deploy. I think this brings me to the sort of second positive aspect, which is at least in the intent, the CRA tries to an extent, exclude pure play open source development from liability, but really put that responsibility on the commercial vendors. On the flip side, the way the legislation is drafted right now, and granted, we receive new amendments every week as it goes through the legislative process, and clearly there has been some sort of positive improvement in the most recent amendments, also thanks to the work that we've been doing, under the auspices of Open Forum Europe and other European policy organizations. But in a nutshell, the bottom line is that currently the CRA doesn't clearly reflect the sort of complex nature of how open source gets embedded in commercial software offerings and hardware offerings. And therefore, the exclusion doesn't clearly exempt, in our opinion, individual contributors, foundations, even sort of commercial package managers like GitHub or Maven Central or even NPM, which offer, whilst being commercial, they do offer free services that are fundamental to the fabric of how open source development happens nowadays. And so there is certainly quite of a concern that if the legislation was to go through as such, it will have potentially two major inadvertent effects. One, putting liability on non-commercial entities, on entities that are not effectively making money, whether it be individuals that are maintainers of open source projects on GitHub, foundations that don't have visibility into how our open source projects are deployed, or again, the intermediaries like package managers and GitHub repositories and sort of Git repository providers. And so that's sort of the first and foremost issue that ultimately might, almost create a reverse incentive to not do open source and not do open source in Europe, which brings me, I think, to the second potential side effect, which I think as much as a professional, I'm worried about it as I am an Italian citizen. Europe bets a lot on open source. And if the law indeed almost disincentivizes folks to carry out open source efforts in Europe or distribute their open source software in Europe, that would actually create, again, a vicious cycle and really potentially hamper the goals that the European Union has with respect to open source and technology. So again, we are positive that changes are being made to the law as it makes through its way through the legislative process, but we think there's more that needs to be done to clarify that the liability should sit with commercial entities effectively making money out of open source rather than the fabric of open source that drives the massive innovation that we've seen over the last 30 years in the open.
And of course, the tech industry loves a good acronym, whether we're talking LF Europe or the LFEAB. Just to bring this to life, demystify this world a little bit. What is the Linux Foundation Europe Advisory Board, and how does that contribute to the overall mission of the Linux Foundation Europe? And can you share any insights on that recent launch too?
I think that the short version of the answer is that, like any community, we take very much at heart the direction and the advice of our community members when it comes to set the direction of Linux Foundation Europe. And so, especially in such a diverse, from a cultural and sort of industrial as well, sort of standpoint, region like Europe, we felt that it was very important to not go too far in terms of defining our priorities and our strategy without having a strong representation of the key participants to LF Europe. And so within 6 months of our launch, we announced last week, or 2 weeks ago, our Linux Foundation Europe Advisory Board, which I'm very honored to lead. It's a group of 23 advisors from some of the largest both technology and industrial companies in Europe. We have SAP, we have Bosch, we have Nokia, we have Ericsson, but also making sure that we have representation from the smaller players, both startups like Dramatic or SparkFabric or SIGUP, as well as sort of trade and policy organizations like our good friends at Open Forum Europe or the Secure Identity Alliance. Look, ultimately, this body will greatly help us, on one hand, defining priorities and focus, and where we will continue to invest as LF Europe, in a way that is representative both of large and small companies. We have more than 10 countries represented. We have very different type of companies represented. And so I think that is absolutely the best way for us to be community-driven when we continue to invest and grow LF Europe. The second, I think, primary role is going to help us uncover opportunities for new collaborations and new projects that will be stood up out of LF Europe. Again, this very diverse from a geographical and corporate type representation really ensures that there is a level playing field in the way we prioritize the projects that we start in Europe. And then, of course, number three is certainly helping us grow the footprint of our community in Europe. As we were talking about it before, Europe has a really strong grassroots open source community. These are over 20 folks that are very plugged in the local community. And the expectation is, of course, that they will help us through events, through community engagement, through introductions to really grow and maximize the impact and sort of the path to value through the projects that we stand up in Europe. I forgot to mention that besides the 20 advisors, which represent the Linux Foundation Europe participants, we also have representation in observer capacity from the select Linux Foundation and Linux Foundation Europe projects. So we do have, representation from Open Wallet Foundation, we do have representation from Silva, and we actually are very proud to have representation from the kernel.org community. In fact, Greg Crow-Hartman, who's the main maintainer of the Linux stable branch, has been a fantastic force in the board, and we're really keen to have him.
And another reason I was excited to get you on the podcast, I was reading about the 2023 Global Spotlight Survey. And again, it provides valuable insights into the open source community. And I'm curious, what findings from the survey did you find most significant? And as someone that's probably been now and seen it all, did anything surprise you from that survey?
Well, a couple of points here. The 2023 survey is actually ongoing right now. We opened it up about 3 weeks ago. We did a public announcement. In fact, a little bit of a shameless plug. Take a chance to fill it. If you have maybe 10 minutes, should be relatively easy and quick. And we really help provide global insights that then we can conjugate and sort of segment on a regional basis as to trends around open source engagement, contribution, where value lies, and also really the differentiation between the different regions in terms of what the priorities are. What I can tell you, though, is that the 22 version of this survey, we started it as a European-specific research. It was called World of Open Source Europe Spotlight 2022. And it definitely uncovered some very interesting outcomes, which actually really served as the basis for how we set up Linux Foundation Europe. I always tend to say that Linux Foundation Europe is community-driven on one hand, and that's why we formed our Linux Foundation Europe Advisory Board, but it's also very much data-driven, and the luxury of having Linux Foundation research producing these amazing reports puts us in a very privileged place when it comes to executing based on data. And so to your question, when I think about the 2022 survey, I think the primary outcome that has really shaped the way we are rolling out LF Europe, sort of piggybacking on our conversations around the public sector, is that open source is absolutely seen as the key to foster the European digital commons and digital sovereignty. This is something that it's clearly recurring and echoed some of the findings of other reports over the last 3-4 years. I mean, the EU is absolutely betting on open source as the way to bring to life a new human-centered internet that is really designed around the values of Europe. And that certainly creates more of a level playing field when it comes to the sort of global technology landscape. But on the flip side, what the report uncovered is that, in fact, the public sector is sort of failing to fully capitalize on open source. There's still very few public entities that can contribute to open source, or that even have a policy that encourages contribution. And already in the first 6 or 7 months, again, we've seen a little bit of some kind of idiosyncrasy, where on one hand, the EU really bets and encourages open source, has an open source first approach. But on the other hand, like we talked about the CRA, there are sort of inadvertent side effects that some of the regulations that are coming down might actually hamper specifically open source in Europe. And so it's no surprise that as we started operating, a lot of our focus has been on better educating Europe and the national sort of governments. The hires that I'm making are really going in that direction. You'll see a pretty big announcement in June when our new hire starts. And then we are continuing to work on more research besides the 2023 Global Spotlight. I can give you a little bit of a preview here. We are going to work on a public sector engagement in open source roadmap and blueprint type report, which is going to be released later this year. So absolutely trying to, based on the findings of the 22 Spotlight, try to really address some of this, I guess, execution gap between the vision and effectively how quickly open source is being supported by the public sector in Europe.
Well, we've got more than a few teasers from you there. I'm going to push my luck now, because many of your community will be looking forward to the summit in Europe. I think it's in Spain in September, the LF Europe Member Summit. So I'm going to ask you probably can't reveal too much, but what can attendees expect from these events this year? Can you give me a sneak peek into the key topics and kind of discussions that will be taking place?
Absolutely. I'm going to probably get in trouble with marketing here, but let me give you a couple of nuggets here. Well, first of all, we're super proud that for the first year, we are going to be hosting a Linux Foundation Europe Member Summit. The Linux Foundation Global Member Summit generally happens in the US, and it's one of the most productive senior level type meetings where, a lot of the sort of transformational projects that the LF hosts get discussed and get even ideated. As much as open source communities, we are very familiar with remote work and sort of distributed collaboration. There's something to be said about bringing together people in person when you're trying to really strategize on a big transformational, disruptive technology project. And so let me just first say how excited we are that within our first year of running LF Europe, the LF has made an investment to have a dedicated Linux Foundation Europe Member Summit. As you said, this will happen on September 18th, the day before the Open Source Summit in Bilbao. I'll have the privilege to keynote MC. So to your question, I see a couple of key areas that we're going to be discussing at the LF Europe Member Summit. One, public sector and private sector collaboration and engagement on open source projects. I envision that has done a fantastic job in the last 20 years to really marry individual contributors' needs with sort of corporate contributors' funding in a now basically proven to be successful recipe and set of governance and blueprints. I would want to see in the years to come a very clearly articulated way for the public sector not only to consume open source, but to actively participate in the governance and funding of open source projects. So I think this is going to be a theme that we discuss both at the Europe Member Summit and, of course, at the Open Source Summit, which is open to the whole community. I think, secondly, we will be discussing a lot of the existing projects that we launched in LF Europe, Open Wallet, Silva, And the 1 or 2 projects that I expect will be launched between now and then, those will have a pretty strong, I think, representation at the summit. And then I think the third area is going to be really forward-looking type collaboration, meaning besides the advisory board, which of course is going to convene and help us drive our priorities for 2024, I think the big question again, if we are truly community-driven, we want our members, our participants, to be able to shape our roadmap. And so what are the areas that Linux Foundation Europe should be focusing on 2024? I think that is going to be a big topic in terms of workshops and really ideation sessions that we will be hosting at Linux Foundation Europe Member Summit. I would be remiss to say that if I wasn't to say that probably AI is going to be a pretty important topic of conversation as we are all grappling with not just the impact that AI has on open source, think about Copilot, think about ChatGPT itself, but really on technology and the very definition of our daily jobs. So I expect for sure a deep conversation on what is the role the Linux Foundation and Linux Foundation Europe can play in AI, especially if you think that the EU is coming down with the AI Act, which it might really set the bar as to what type of collaborations make sense to have in the open and with which goals. So I think these are pretty, I can't go too much into the specifics, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of what we might be talking about.
Absolutely. Exciting times ahead. It sounds like we're going to have to get you on later in the year. Sounds like there's a lot of big things coming. Before I let you go, Laura, I always like to end the show on a note where the guest leaves me something other than their insights. And that is, on this occasion, I'm going to ask you a song that has inspired you, means something to you, that we can add to our Spotify playlist. But all I'm going to ask you is, what song would you like to leave us with and why?
Well, I'm going to start it with the why and then I'll tell you the song. This goes a little bit personal, but my life and definitely my wife's has been sort of evolving in the last 6 years. We were blessed with a kid almost 6 years ago now. His name is Leonardo, and he's a special needs kid. He's had a lot of trouble in the first year of his life between genetic issues, hospital situations, and that was a pretty stressful period of our life, and it was coming while we were both very busy at work. In fact, my wife ended up sort of deciding to sort of leave her job to take care of him full time. And I think the main learning from this conversation, sort of from this experience, as we both are very ambitious people, we all work really hard and sometimes fall into sort of the grinding machine of always wanting to grow, always wanting to do more, sometimes not even take a victory lap on the really important accomplishments that we're having in our career, at least from our humble standpoint. I think Leo taught us a new definition of happiness. He's had so much trouble in his life, but he continues to be as happy, as smiley, as sort of contagious in his energy as it can be. And so he's been a major influence in my life over the last 6 years. And so the song that I've chosen is a song from Sia, who's called Never Give Up. It's maybe a little cliche, but the reality is that on one hand, when troubled times come, you need to be able to plow forward. But truly knowing that probably happiness is not just about work or career accomplishments, and it's really subjective to each one of us. And so I think that's a really good sort of motivating song that I'd like to leave you with.
Wow, what a powerful story and a great song too. So I'm going to add that song to our playlist. It's also a beautiful moment to end our conversation on today. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just want to find out more information about everything that we discussed today, where would you like to point everyone listening?
Well, I'll do 2 shameless plug here for Linux Foundation Europe. linuxfoundation.eu is our website. You can find all sort of information around our upcoming events, how to join as a participant, and of course, propose new projects under Linux Foundation Europe. We would love to hear from you. And then we haven't talked about it much, but of course, my other hat is FINOS, the Fintech Open Source Foundation. And so if you're interested to know more about how banks are collaborating and now becoming even open source leaders, I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but feel free to go to finos.org. We are a global community based in New York, London, and across all the major financial system hubs. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I've absolutely loved chatting with you today. So much so, I think we should get you on twice this year. I would like to get you on a little bit later in the year to discuss all things FINOS, and then also towards the end of the year, get you on to learn more about Linux Foundation Europe, how things are moving there. But more than anything, just a big thank you for sharing your story, the work that you're doing, and also that beautiful story behind your song choice too. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'd be happy to come over whenever you want me.
What a great conversation, a great guy there. And I love that personal story that he shared about his son and how it taught him a new definition of happiness. And there were so many big takeaways for me, such as why it's clear that the open source landscape is evolving rapidly. And as a result, the roles of organisations like the Linux Foundation Europe is more crucial than ever. From fostering those regional collaborations to clarifying policy implications and driving engagement within the public sector. I am looking forward to hearing more about those 2023 Global Spotlight survey results and also learning more about that upcoming Linux Foundation Europe Member Summit. There's no doubt we're in for some exciting times ahead, and no matter where you're listening in the world, where you're from, if you're part of the Linux family or you just want to share your insights and a few takeaways for you from this conversation, I'd love for you to share them with me, please. I invite you to join the conversation. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just at Neil C. Hughes. Let me know what you thought of today's episode. Let me know what you think we missed, what you'd like to see us add in a future conversation. I'm open to anything. So keep those messages coming in, and a big thank you for listening today. But until next time, don't be a stranger.